Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live broadcast here from AutoCrit. AutoCrit really is the home for writers online. We have our fully functional writers desk where and you can plan and dream and edit and work on your manuscript in a very powerful workspace. We have our online community where you can interact with fellow authors, and then we have our Academy page where you can learn more about the craft of writing, including presentations similar to what I'm about to talk about. Yes, I'm going to talk about a few rules for how to format dialogue correctly. And, this is the sort of topic that is incredibly important because the last thing you want to do is make a bad first impression by making simple editing mistakes, simple grammar mistakes. Um, it's not the end all be all, and that, of course, certainly brilliant people will slip up from time to time. But if you have a lot of these on a single page, if you include a lot of these early on in your writing, well, there are people that will literally stop reading you. Perhaps they'll think you just didn't spend much effort on your work. You might get denied. An agent might turn you down. You might not get shopped around the same level. It's very important to put your best foot forward whenever we can. And so, while this may not be one of the most exciting topics in a sense, it's certainly a very important one. So, I thought that it would be good to take some time out this week and talk about this. And if you have any questions, I know we have some live listeners here and watchers. If you have any questions as we go through, feel free to let me know. All right, so we're just going to go through these tips really quickly here. It's going to be a shorter episode than normal, but I think it's going to be very fun. Okay. So the first thing it's pretty obvious. When you're trying to format dialogue correctly, use quotation marks. And you're like, yeah, duh. But I mean, it's true. You shouldn't have a dialogue just come out of the blue without us knowing that somebody, in fact, is talking, that there is, in fact, sound being represented somewhere. Even if you have a disembodied voice, you often want to put this in quotation marks. uh it's important, and it may seem obvious, but I can tell you I've seen it where writers will just forget. They'll have somebody doing an action, and then they'll start getting in dialogue, and I'm like, wait a minute, I think they're saying that out loud. And sure enough, they are, right? Now, something to keep in mind, and this is where you might debate this, is an internal thought. Do you have to put internal thoughts in quotation marks? And the answer is not necessarily. Usually, what I recommend is to be consistent. So sometimes authors will put internal thoughts in italics as its own paragraph, right? So the person is looking at an object, and then it'll be dropped down in italics and it'll say, whatever, wow, just what I wanted, right? um, and that's an internal dialogue. It won't necessarily put quotation mark, that's just what I wanted, close quotation mark, they said, or something like that. So you have that option. So, but if it's spoken aloud, which is a little bit redundant, if somebody's saying it, if it is vocalized, uh, always use quotation marks because then it's clear to the audience. Okay. All right. Internal dialogue, you got a little more of wiggle room there. All right. So then the next step is make sure you start a new paragraph for each speaker. You don't want to have two groups of people speaking in a series of sentences. It is quite confusing because our assumption is if we read quotation and they said and another quotation, we're going to assume it's the same person talking. And so we're going to have to double back if it's not, in fact, the same person talking. It's a great shorthand to tell us, actually, this is somebody else talking. And often we can infer who that is because of who was indicated in the scene. I will say, if you haven't indicated the people in the scene where it would be easy to infer who the second person is talking, realize that's going to come across as disembodied text until we know who is talking. So I have an example. We don't want something like, "What in the world?" she asked. "I don't know," he said, because that second "I don't know," you're going to start reading as the same person, whoever the she asked was. You're going to read it like that, and then you're going to have to double back. And this is even more confusing if you have a longer second sentence. Instead, you want to put it as a new paragraph, depending on how you're formatting your paragraphs, right? It'll look differently on the page, but it needs to be a new paragraph because then we know it's another person talking. Now, as I said, in a situation like this with a second sentence, I don't know, until you get the he said, we're not sure who the second person is talking unless you've previously established in the scene that there are two people there, right? So if it's whatever, Bob and Laura walked into the room. What in the world? She asked. I don't know, he said. I mean, you maybe wouldn't even need the second dialogue tag because you're going to assume it's Bob, but fair enough. Often early on in dialogue, you're going to indicate it for a back and forth. All right. We're getting some questions. I'm going to flag them and I will come to them later. So keep those questions coming and whatnot. All right. Okay. So the next thing I want to say is forget to include dialogue tags, right? We don't just want disembodied dialogue. If you have dialogue come out of nowhere, well, we're not sure who in fact is talking. Now, this is the case even in the example I just mentioned. If you say two people entered a room and somebody is talking, we still don't necessarily know which one of those two people are talking, right? The woman walked into the room and stared at Jack. When are they coming? Soon. Who said what? I don't know. Did the woman say when are they coming and Jack said soon? Perhaps because the woman was the subject of the sentence before. However, the focal point of that sentence was Jack, right? Because the woman went and spoke to Jack. So I don't know. I'm not sure, right? Depending on how you read this, you could infer either. So no, this is not great. You would want to have when are they coming? She asked, and then soon you can decide maybe not to say Jack answered or Jack said, because perhaps it's obvious. But even then, like I said, usually when you have the first few sentences in dialogue, you often indicate who is talking at that point just to make it clear. Now, after the first couple of sentences, you don't necessarily need to include the dialogue tags, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, the next piece of advice, or the next rule, I should say, the grammatical rule, is that punctuation should always go inside the quotation marks, right? Another way of thinking about it is to think punctuation always goes before a quotation mark, but that can be a little confusing because there's not always punctuation before a quotation mark, because sometimes the quotation mark starts the sentence, right? But if there is any, yes, it goes before it, either the first one or the second one, right? So, for example, how could he do such a thing? That exclamation point is on the wrong side because it is part of the quotation. You can think about it from that standpoint. What is in that quotation? What represents that quotation? The exclamation part mark is part of the person talking, right? It's not a separate entity that's existing and floating around in space. There isn't like an exclamation point just, living out there. It is part of that statement. How could he do such a thing? So we need it within the dialogue. We need it within the quotation marks, right? We do not want it outside of the quotation marks. So if I was going to fix that, well, I would just move it over to the other side like that. And now it's correct. Okay. The other place where this can come up, it's more common, is with commas. So you'll see this a lot more than the exclamation point example. It's a wonderful thing, she said. The package has arrived. Yeah, that comma is really part of the quotation. It's not part of the she said. Now, there could be punctuation in that section in between the quotes, perhaps, right? In which case it's its own thought. It's separate than the quotation. But if we're talking about the quotation, the actual punctuation needs to go within the quotation marks. It's a very easy mistake to make, but it will is something that people often pick up, and this is something that even not super savvy people will pick up, and it just makes you look sloppy. And it's also it can be confusing because it essentially indicates that it's not part of the quotation, and that's not your intention. Now, somebody was mentioning an author that doesn't use quotation marks. People will do experimental things with quotation marks, particularly like in literary fiction and or just punctuation in general. Obviously, there are exceptions to every rules. There are poems that are indecipherable because it looks like somebody just like stepped on their keyboard and things like that. Obviously we're not talking about that. If you're breaking punctuation rules for the sake of mixing things up or something like that, fair enough. But just realize you're gonna stand out, right? So yes, you don't want something like "It's a wonderful thing," she said. E. Cummings, yes, is an example of not using capital letters. You want "It's a wonderful thing," comma, she said, right? Okay. Now quotes within quotes get single quotation marks. So if somebody is using either scare quotes or they're quoting somebody else within a quotation, it is a single quotation mark, not a double. So for example, I'm thinking this surprise party is a bust, she said. No, that's confusing. You actually will use a single and it'll look like this. I'm thinking this surprise party is a bust. That's how you indicate that. That's the reason why we have that single little quotation mark. Obviously, it also doubles as an apostrophe at times, but that is why we have that kind of construction, right? Now, on the flip side, um, well, no, no, no. I don't want to say on the flip side. This is what you do when it is again, it is a quote within a quote. So if somebody were to say, I was talking to Bob and he said everything is great. Again, the everything is great is going to go within a single quotation mark within the quotation marks. You had the quote within the quote question last night. Got it right. Ha ha ha. That's awesome. I like, the teacher that said you had creative grammar. Yeah, usually that's a little passive aggressive. Now, capitalization shouldn't happen unless it's the beginning of a new sentence. Where this can get confusing is an example such as this. The world is wonderful, he said. She can't wait to experience it. That's not correct because the she in that context should not be capitalized. Just because you are going back into the quotation doesn't mean now you start capitalizing that second part because it's not a new sentence. It's all one sentence. So it looks like this. The world is wonderful, he said. She can't wait to experience it. It's only if we're breaking the thought with a period that it would have to be capitalized. So if it was the world is wonderful, he said, period, then she can't wait to experience it would be a capital S. Now, sometimes you get questions about when to apply this, right? When do you make that the first few words there a sentence versus having it continue? And I have not ever really seen a definitive statement on that. Like, what makes obviously, you don't want to have like run on sentences and you don't want to have inconsistent you don't want to have run-on sentences. You don't want to have problems where the sentence breaks apart because it's so long and things like that. But in terms of how it's kind of the question of how long can you make a sentence in general, right? You can make very long sentences that are still grammatically correct, maybe aren't the best idea. There are reasons why you want to make this one complete thought with the he said in the middle, and I'll get to that in a minute. Versus breaking it up. But some of it, somewhat, it can be a subjective decision. Obviously, if the second part of it, she can't wait to experience it, is not a complete thought and it relies on the first part, the world is wonderful. No, you can't do that. Now, in this instance, these are really like two complete sentences. So you could argue Yeah, it's probably better if I actually had done he said, period. She can't wait to experience it is a separate sentence, right? The thought. You're iffy when there's dialogue broken up in the middle by an action tag. Action tag would be the same thing. However, we're going to get to action tags in a minute and how I feel like you really should utilize action tags because they are, in fact, different. Interruption should be indicated with M dashes. So you don't want to do an ellipsis. That's different. You want to do an M dash. So you don't want to do what are you doing with an ellipsis. You want to do with an M dash. This is a common mistake. M dashes are to represent somebody kind of waffling or thinking, right? It's a pause. It is not an interruption. M dashes are for an interruption. So you'll see this a fair amount, and you could say, well, if you see this a fair amount, isn't this more of a subjective rule? I would say no. I would say it's just a lot of people get it wrong. I would recommend the bottom versus the top. Um, the so for the ellipsis, this would be the idea is that somebody is trailing, they're not being interrupted. And so this context doesn't make sense. Now, if it's like, I'm not really sure what to think about this. Let me see dot dot dot. And then the next person says, aha, that's different because they're not being interrupted. You see what I mean? So those are that would be the difference. And trailing with an ellipsis is the idea is that the person literally is like trailing in thought. It's like, what should we do? And then the other person says whatever. And so if it's an interruption, I don't think we should shut up. Don't say that again. Do the M dash. Okay. I hope that's clear. Tell me in the comments if that's not clear, and I will try to give more examples there. Hyphens are trendy. They're even used in the place of commas. I think you might be in M dashes used to like break up sentences, right? I think one reason why is because people are getting rather conversational and and I forget the term for it, and I even did a video about this, so I'll plug myself. There is a literary term for squirrel moments, like going here and then going here and then going here, and often you represent that with an ellipsis with an M dash. So it's like I was thinking of, but really I should, but I don't think so. But then I could, and I think writers are writing more and more like that to sound more conversational. It sounds kind of TikTok-y as it were, or whatever. It sounds like normal speech. And so, yeah, you're seeing where M dash is used for that. If you're, and again, that is the correct way to punctuate that. You wouldn't want to do that with ellipses as much. Outside of dialogue, you don't see use it by a major author. I don't think so. I think it is more of an independent author thing. Independent authors tend to be faster on trends than major authors, because I think one reason is that professional authors, well, I guess they're all professional, but traditionally published authors will be at the behest of style guides, right? They will be subject to style guides. They will have professional editors work on their stuff. And yes, I know a lot of independent people on Amazon do that as well, but a lot of them are willing to kind of push boundaries, experiment, do different things, not follow the rules, etc. So you'll see it more in the Amazon world than you will otherwise. Okay. Dialogue tag placement does matter. Yes. Where you place the dialogue tag affects the way you observe the sentence. So it's not just arbitrary, right? You could say, well, a dialogue tag at the end, not necessarily. You could do an action tag like Charles stared at him, and then you just start going into dialogue, and we know who's talking. This can be tricky because in a situation like this, well, I don't know who's talking. Is it Charles or is it him? Right. And this is the danger of anything. Sometimes people call it buried dialogue and things like that. There's a danger to this. It's a little bit subjective in terms of is it okay or is it not? Some people will like never allow for this. But you can. And then the other thing, you just have to be careful. about if the action tag is doing the job. I would say in this situation, not really the best. Now, what if instead of it saying Charles stared at him, it literally just said Charles said, I'm wondering what you thought. Maybe later. Okay. Well, now it's clear Charles is talking, right? Um, Somebody said, why would anyone think him was talking in the sentence? Perhaps not. I'm just saying you did not make it abundantly clear. You could say, well, most people wouldn't read it that way. And I think that's fair. I think most people wouldn't read it that way, but I'm just saying you have the option, perhaps. And I generally don't like to give people options when I can avoid it, particularly something on who is talking. So if you did Charles said, I'm wondering what you thought maybe later. It's not necessarily the end of the world. It's not as common of a construction as putting it at the end. And one of the reasons why is because of how you construct it. Oh, yes. Shouldn't there be a comma before Charles said? Like that? Yes. You could do that. Yes. You're right. What about, I'm wondering what you thought Charles said maybe later, like that. Now, there's a reason why this affects you differently than, I'm wondering what you thought maybe later Charles said. Do you see the difference? In this one, I have an interruption of the dialogue, and in this one, I don't. This one, I hear a pause in the dialogue. This one, I don't. So this one, I'm hearing, I'm wondering what you thought, maybe later, Charles said, versus, I'm wondering what you thought, Charles said, maybe later. So this one, you have a sense that there was a break. You just hear it, even though you haven't told the audience that. You didn't say, Charles, stared out at the scenery, taking it in, wondering what he would say next, maybe later, right? And so if and so you might want to do this. You might want to have this break in the middle just to indicate a pause in the talking. It's a possibility. It's one reason why people, I think, construct it this way, is just because it subconsciously affects us that way. Now, in that sense, we have to be careful how much goes into that tag, and we will talk about that in a bit. Dialogue tags do create a sense of timing. Here we are. So, for example, what do you think? Charles said. After all, the man was the closest thing he'd ever have to a father, even if he was just his football coach for the past 20 years. I'm not sure. Yeah, obviously it's terrible on multiple levels, right? Not only are we putting a crazy info dump in the middle of the sentence, and all of this, and it's not grammatically the best, but the other issue is that you get the idea that Charles is just staring off into space while we have all of this other thought going on, right? He's thinking about the man was the closest thing he never had to a father, even though blah, 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 blah. And then he says, I'm not sure. And do you really want that? And probably not, right? Most people don't just freeze up in the middle of talking and just stare into space and then continue their talking, right? At the very least, if they're going to do that, they will be doing an action. They will be taking a long drink of water. They will be walking over to a window. They will be staring off into space. Um, and then you would indicate what the other characters are noticing as this person is talking, right? So if you said, what do you think? Charles said. He stared off into space. After all, the man, then it's like, okay, I get that the guy's having a moment and he's just going off on a tangent. And you could still say, well, this is terrible info dumping, and fair enough. But at least then it doesn't come across like he's just frozen and nobody has any idea what's going on. And, you have a terrible sense of rhythm. So dialogue tags create a sense of timing. So keep that in mind when you use them in order to interrupt dialogue like this. You want to generally keep it short, in the same way that somebody might pause if they were actually speaking. Now, action really should be a separate sentence. You are tempted sometimes to make action into a tag, but it really shouldn't be, because the quotation is not connected to the action. It is its own entity. So unless you are using the action to describe what the Unless you're using the action to describe talking, it should not it's a separate thought. We're not describing the talking anymore. We're describing something else, right? So, for example, "I don't believe you." He stood at the wall. You're making it sound like the standing is somehow dialogue, and that doesn't make any sense, right? If he said he spoke towards the wall, okay, fair enough, right? Or uh he said standing at the wall, right? Otherwise, no, I don't believe you, period. He stood at the wall, which is an action tag that tells you who is talking, but but it is not incorrect like the top example. The top example again makes it seem like the verb stood is what's in the quotations, and that doesn't make any sense. Now, one that comes up maybe more often than that would be something like "they smiled" or something. And again, I generally don't like that verb being used for talking because people don't smile their words. It's like hard, or even if you're speaking through gritted teeth, you would say "they spoke through gritted teeth" or something like that. Um, but what you would really want to do is make it its own sentence, right? "I don't believe you, period. He smiled, perhaps." But often you're better off just saying "said," which gets to our next point. You said most of the time. Said and asked, right? This is a bit of a subjective point, right? This is not a rule. It's not grammatically incorrect to say they retorted, they blustered, they responded, whatever. All right. Those are all valid verbs. But the problem is you are bogging down your text with verbs that aren't doing that much. They responded is no different than really saying they said. It's just or replied. It's not really any different than said because a reply is talking. Right? You could say, well, it's talking in response, but isn't that in the dialogue tag? Isn't that in the dialogue anyway? Right? If you say, "What do you want to do?" "I'm not sure," he replied. Well, you don't really need he replied because we know it's a reply, right? So you would want to say you can just say he said. Now, is it the end of the world if you did reply? No. But what can happen is I think a lot of writers are worried about using said or asked because they think, well, that's not very creative if I just use said and asked all the time. Isn't that fatiguing to the reader? You might even find it fatiguing, but for the vast majority of people, they like it. It disappears, it goes away, it serves the mechanical purpose. We don't think about it, and it's great. And you also lose the temptation of the verb doing too much. The verb should never be describing what would be clear in the text, unless you're talking about something like volume, which how would you know that from the text, right? So they shouted or whispered, yeah, fair enough. But even something like they asked or replied, it's not really necessary, right? And so you don't want something that is, again, you don't want it to be holding up for something. So if it's this table is or even in in the punctuation, you wouldn't want to have "this table is steady, period. They asked," or comma, "they asked." Well, no, it should be a question mark. "This table is steady?" And then you might still have the "he asked" because you may not want to say "he said," but it is fairly redundant. But you definitely want to avoid things like they blustered or something if it's not clear in the dialogue. Um, "I think you're beautiful," they blustered. Well, if the idea is that they're saying that kind of mean spirited, I would say you really want in the action for that to be clear, right? They crossed their arms and rolled their eyes. "I think that you're beautiful." Then you're like getting the right tone. Otherwise, you're doing a double back, right? Because if you're reading the dialogue straightforward and you think, oh, well, they're saying that in a straightforward tone, and then you get to the end and it's like, they whatever you want to say, they blustered or whatever, or even an adverb. They s- they said begrudgingly or something. Well, if it's not that obvious in the dialogue that they're saying it begrudgingly, I really wonder whether or not you need that. So be careful. I'm not, and so the point of all of this is not to say that any of this is a grammatical rule you're breaking. It's not against the rules to not use said, of course. It's not against the rules to use adverbs to modify the verb which expresses that they're talking. However, not using said and using adverbs might indicate that what's in the quotation marks is not good enough. So look out for them. Think of it as like a red flag. It's like, do I really need this extra word and whatever? And I will say, if the reason why you have a word besides said is just I'm sick of using said, you're not following the way that a lot of writers are writing these days. Thoughts on they growled? You can't talk while they growled. Yeah, but yeah, if you're talking about like something like a shifter, it's possible, right? Because like hissing is kind of the same thing if it's a snake. If you're there's times that you deliberately want to use weird verbs because you're talking about something that is paranormal, right? And so that's different. I would say that's an intentional not using said. But using growled for dialogue, I mean, that's one of those things that people take not literally. And I guess that's the same reason why people say smiled. They don't take it literally. They just take it as it's in a nice tone of voice. So it is a little your mileage may vary, but I would look out for it, right? Look out for whether or not what you're saying, what the verb is actually a verb that describes talking in the first place. Okay, so something else to look out for while you are formatting your dialogue is not overusing your dialogue tags. We can be concerned that every time somebody is talking, we have to tell the audience who is talking. And this is not true. This is not grammatically necessary. If we can infer who's talking, well, we don't need the dialogue tag at all, right? And I mentioned some examples earlier of that. So the most common use case you see of this is where you have a back and forth between two people, and you start off. It's like she said this, he said that, she said this, he said that, and then it drops. And you're like, okay, every time I start a new paragraph, I know new person, the other person, new person, other person, new person, other person. And then the other thing that the author will often do is put in action beats or thinking beats or something in the prose to indicate maybe who is talking as well. Keep in mind, though, if you ever drop back into the conversation, we're going to assume it's the opposite of where we left off. So don't drop off the tags if that's not the case. Don't have he said this, she said this, and then the tags go away, and it's like, okay, he said, she said, she walked towards the door. I'm still going. Then I'm like, I don't know who's talking next, right? Because is it the person that just did the action, or is it the last person who was talking? Or if it's like he said this, she said this, he said this, she said this, he said this, he said this. There was a thunderclap. I might not know who's talking next. You could say, well, I'm going to follow the rhythm, perhaps, but I would say be cautious of that. Okay, and also, what if there's a lot of talking? Like, what if each person says something very long, multiple sentences? Sometimes you can just lose the thread, right? Even though it's just back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, sometimes you can just forget who's talking. So sometimes you do want to come back in with them. But the important thing about a dialogue tag is that we know who is speaking. That is its function, that is its purpose. So if we don't need to know that, then you run the risk of using it for not its purpose. So all right, let me go through some of these comments and questions that I had. Feel free to throw in any other questions about formatting here. Okay. If person A speaks and person B doesn't speak but nods and shrugs, and the person A speaks again, is that three paragraphs? Yes. You really should be doing that in general. I mean, it's not like, I guess, a completely hard and fast rule that you can't have. Well, I know it's not. You can have paragraphs where multiple subjects are mentioned within it. You could say, Bob was over drinking punch and Charles was dancing. Shirley, on the other hand, was, yeah, I mean, you can do that. When you're talking about dialogue, and you have a paragraph that starts with dialogue, and then it's like, she said, Meanwhile, Bob was drinking some punch. Generally, you want to put the meanwhile Bob was drinking some punch on another paragraph. It's just cleaner. It's easier to track. We understand we're out of the paragraph that's referring to the dialogue. It's yeah, it's a much better way of handling things. All right. What about how do you format poetry inside of dialogue? My research has been inconclusive. Yeah, that would be tricky, right? Because if they just start citing it, you would think the single quotations would be the start of it, but then it's like, but that's not the format of it. Generally, when I've seen that, I've seen the person will say, they'll start it out where it's like, "And the person said," and then it's colon, and then it's the poem. I feel like that's it, because that's also what generally happens when people sing, and they're going to sing something lengthy, right? So I would say that's what I would do. I would say she then, because she'd be like, whatever it is, "I love Emily Dickinson," she said, and then you would have a new paragraph. And then she proceeded to recite the whatever this poem colon poem. That's how I generally remember it being formatted. That is a good question though, and feel free to comment below if you disagree with that. But that's generally how I think of it being formatted. Um, I like those sort of stumper questions. How do you punctuate a long stretch of dialogue that is interrupted by actions? Basically, running dialogue that runs into several paragraphs. I'm a little bit confused by that. Whatever is talking needs to be within quotation marks. It doesn't matter how long it is. You can have multiple paragraphs, and then you're going to close the quotation mark eventually anyway. Um, but usually, it's going to be one. It's going to be one block. You're not gonna just keep going. And there's a and usually authors will fix that by saying they continued, and then they keep going, because it's just so big otherwise, right? If they're just going and going and going and going and going. If a person has a long speech, should it be separated with action tags? That's more of a form than a grammar question, and I would say yes. You don't want somebody to just pontificate and just keep going and going and going and going, and you never are breaking it up with any sort of actions, because they're just standing there. I mean, what about reactions to what they're saying, right? So imagine you were talking about whatever, like the State of the Union address, right? You could have that whole scene be like, and the president got up and they said, yes, but like, I mean, obviously in that speech, there's interruptions, there's people applauding, there's maybe people stating things, but then there's other things too. They're like, people are shuffling in their seats and things like that. So you would stop the quote and then you would go into the action, and then at some point you start the quote again, and then then the question is, when you put in those quotation marks again, does the audience know that this is the same person continuing their speech? Which is why I said sometimes what people do is they'll indicate that in the prose. They'll say, whatever, the president continued their speech, and then they keep going, right? They cleared their throat and continued, and then they keep going. And just to clarify, so you don't think, oh, it's some other disembodied person in the crowd or things like that. Uh, I mean, generally speaking, if you're tempted to have like lengthy pages where characters are monologuing, that's a very dangerous thing to do in general. So, beyond the punctuation issue, I wonder from a storytelling issue whether or not it's that great. But again, the way that you generally make a scene like that work is by switching off to what other people are doing anyway. And so, that's and so the punctuation would be affected by that. But otherwise, no, in theory, you could have a quotation that just goes on and on and on and on and on and on, and then you would close it, quotes, and then move on, right? And you can even have paragraphs within that. If there is a question mark before the ending quotation mark, do you put a comma after the quotation mark? And before she said, I'm a little bit confused by what you mean. Are you asking if you need to have a comma in addition to the quotation mark because you are putting dialogue tag in the middle? Hold on. Let me find my example here. So like where was it? So something like this. The second example, this first sentence has bad capitalization. But the world is wonderful, he said, right? So if you wanted to make that a question, the world is wonderful, he asked, that comma would just become a would just go like that. And then I guess the question is should this be capitalized or not? And I would say no in this situation. You would not need another comma. You don't need like this. Question mark is the punctuation for the situation. But it would be like he asked, like that. Okay. I hope that clears that up. I have Catherine in the comments too, just in case I make any errors, because I'm not infallible as well. Let's see here. Anything else? Yes, as Catherine says, talking heads conversations, no anchoring, world building around them. You want to break it up with nonverbal communication, stuff going around them, etc., etc. Period after said and capitalize she. You could. So you could have that be like this, right? Or like this. And in fact, in this example, I would probably prefer that because I feel like it's kind of two separate thoughts, but you know, uh, there's a little bit of wiggle room there. But unless this is a complete sentence, she does not have to be capitalized. Unless you end it with a period there. All right. Okay. All right. So we have accountability club on Monday at 11 a.m. We have a mystery club on Mondays at 8:30 p.m. Today is Tuesday, and tonight we are going to do a fantasy club at 8 p.m. I'm going to be talking about endings in fantasy slash sci-fi. Um, if you don't write fantasy or sci-fi, I recommend joining us for that. It's going to be great. Tomorrow, Wednesday at 6 p.m., we have horror club. So we have lots going on in the autocrat world. Of course, on this channel, you can always like, subscribe, hit the bell, and hear more in the future from us. How would you show simultaneous action during the dialogue? I bought this cup at the flea market the other day, but as he mentions the cup, he picks it up, etc., etc. I would do just that, right? If you're talking about simultaneous action, you often do that before the dialogue, so the person is imagining it. So you would say, he picked up the cup, and then you would say, I picked up the cup, period. I bought this cup at the flea market the other day, right? Or I bought this at the flea market the other day. And then you know what they're talking about and they're doing it. And then you could even go further. You could say, I bought this at the flea market the other day, comma, he said as he picked up the cup or something like that. That's another way of doing it. I bought this cup at the flea market the other day, comma, he said as he, and then it's like, okay, that happened at the same time as he stared at the cup or whatever, waved it around or something like that. But it can be separate thoughts. It just depends. Like you said, you wanted it simultaneous. So if you have, I bought this cup at the flea market the other day, period. He picked up the cup. That does imply that they didn't happen at the same time. So you probably would need to have the he said as he, or he picked up the cup and said something like that. Right? As he picked up the cup, he said, yeah, that's another option. Was he monologuing again? Yes, we want to avoid that for sure. Speaking of which, I don't want to monologue here too long. So again, if you ever have any comments, please like, subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see all of you around AutoCrit. Thank you so much for joining me, and you have a wonderful day and week. Bye, everybody.